So as you can see, the topic that we'll be quickly looking at here is change in Republican strategy. It is truthfully more about the hunger strikes themselves initially, but the reason it's called change in Republican strategy is, as you will see, Republicans, Sinn Féin, the IRA use the hunger strikes themselves as a way of making a massive change in how they've been attempting to gain peace. Well, they say peace, attempting to gain Irish unity, truth be told. And you can see on the right hand side of your screen, it has a poster here. Sinn Féin winning seats would worry me. A quote from Margaret Thatcher. And it says, "Give her a headache, vote Adams." That's Jerry Adams, the leader of Sinn Féin. And as you will see, Republicans moved from never having contested elections at all in the history of Northern Ireland to suddenly seeking to win seats and try and gain power. There's three main areas we need to look at: explaining the reasons for the hunger strikes of 1980 to 81, describing the reactions to the hunger strike, and then also describe the change that takes place in Republican strategy itself. I'll start off just by showing you this image, which is a H representing the H blocks where the hunger strikes took place. There is 12 faces on this one as opposed to 10. It includes two people who actually died on hunger strike in English prisons before the hunger strikes began, but we're more focused on the 10 men who died as part of the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland in 1981. And you can see there's the H blocks themselves, what's called more correctly is referred to as Her Majesty's Prison Maze, more commonly colloquially referred to as the H blocks themselves. This is where that H symbol comes from. So we'll start off by looking at the reasons for the hunger strikes of 1980 and 1981. A bit of background. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, successive British governments had unsuccessfully tried to solve the Irish problem. What that means is British government after British government after British government have been trying to, Labour and Tory, had been trying to resolve this Irish problem which existed in Northern Ireland. And the IRA, as a bit of further background, had begun a bombing campaign in Britain targeting pubs in towns like Guildford and Birmingham throughout the 1970s. And this was causing a real headache for the British government to have deaths of British citizens in the mainland United Kingdom. After the collapse of power sharing in 1974, which you saw with Sunday, the British government took a two-stage approach to cutting violence. There's two things they're going to do to try and cut violence in Northern Ireland. The first is something called Ulsterisation, and the second is something called criminalisation. Now, we'll begin by looking at Ulsterisation. Essentially, there was a reduction in the number of British Army personnel, British Army troops in Northern Ireland in favour of increased numbers of the RUC and the UDR, the Ulster Defence Regiment. That was a section of the army made up of people exclusively from Northern Ireland that was introduced in the 1970s to replace the B Specials. Now, the Ulster Defence Regiment, as I said, it was an army of local part-time soldiers from Northern Ireland. And why? Well, really the reason is the British government is unhappy with the amount of deaths of British Army personnel in Northern Ireland. It's making them unpopular back at home to see so many troops coming back home in coffins. So they try to remove the amount of British soldiers from England, Scotland and Wales fighting in Northern Ireland and increase numbers of local people from Northern Ireland serving in the RUC and the UDR. Now, criminalisation is the first reason why a hunger strike began. This policy sought to categorise paramilitary prisoners as criminals as opposed to political prisoners. Now, the reason that's important is because in 1972, something called special category status was introduced for paramilitary prisoners in Northern Ireland. This meant the paramilitary prisoners wouldn't be treated as if they were normal criminals, but instead would be treated as prisoners of war if their crimes had a political motive. So if they were a member of the IRA and they've been conducting a crime based on a political motivation, if they were doing it for political reasons, not just being a normal criminal, carrying out criminal acts because they were a criminal. If it is a political motivation, then they had a special status as a prisoner of war, a de facto prisoner of war. They were treated different to other prisoners and had more freedoms. For example, they were allowed to wear their own clothing, and they could also freely meet with other, prisoners of war, or special category status prisoners, other political prisoners, other paramilitary prisoners. However, because of the growing violence throughout the 1970s and because of the inability to deal with the IRA threat, in March 1976, the Labour government made a decision to remove special category status from paramilitaries, meaning they wouldn't be treated as de facto prisoners of war. Instead, they would just be treated as any other criminal in a prison would be treated. Paramilitary prisoners would now be housed in a new prison at the old Long Kesh internment detention centre that we've seen previously. And this will become officially known, as I've said, as Her Majesty's Prison Maze, but really colloquially it is referred to as the H blocks because of the shape of these prisons, as you can see on your screen. So that's the first reason that the hunger strike begins, because they're unhappy with criminalisation and they want to bring back special category status and bring back their right to be treated not as criminals but as prisoners of war. That's the first reason the hunger strike began. The next reason the hunger strike began is because there had already been other protests against criminalisation, other protests in favour of bringing back special category status, but they weren't working. So Republicans detested the removal, they hated the removal of special category status, and they had unsuccessfully launched protests against its removal. The blanket protest began in 1976, and this is called this name aptly because prisoners refused to wear their prison uniform and instead would strip themselves down, refuse to wear the uniform, and simply wrap themselves in blankets. These people were called blanket men. The second one then was called the Dirty Protest, and this began in 1978, and it too had failed to bring about an end to special category status. As part of the Dirty Protest, prisoners refused to leave their cells to wash or to slop out. To slop out essentially means for the purpose of the bathroom, they refused to empty any of their waste into a toilet and then empty it out. By late 1980, over 340 of the 837 Republican prisoners were involved in these two protests, but they hadn't worked. The British government was still refusing to treat paramilitary prisoners as special category prisoners, as prisoners of war, and was still continuing to treat them as normal prisoners. And so this is why the hunger strikes eventually come about. It's the next stage to try and bring back special category status. Public demonstration and protests outside the prisons had little success, and even attacks on prison wardens, prison guards, wasn't enough to pressure the government to bring back special category status. So that is why the hunger strikes come about. You can see here a photo, victory to the blanket men, POWs, prisoners of war. And you can see it has the different names of people, which you will see later on are actually hunger strikers. This is then part of the Dirty Protest. You can see in 1978, you can see blanket men in their cell wearing blankets as opposed to prison uniform. And part of this, instead of slopping out, instead of going to the toilet and emptying their waste like they were supposed to do in their cells, they would refuse to have any real furniture in their cells and would apply their waste to the walls, their own excrement to the walls, as you can see in these images. You can see an image here of it being cleaned. The next reason then that the hunger strikes commenced was because of a history of hunger and hunger strikes used to try and overcome problems within Irish republicanism. So hunger strikes have previously been a successful and traditional Republican tactic in the past. And because they worked in the past, there was hope that if they used them now, this would persuade the British to bring back special category status for those prisoners, to treat them as political prisoners, not as criminals. It had been used in protests against the government north and south of the border. It had even been used in England. For example, in 1974, the Price sisters, Marion and Dolores Price, used it to secure their transfer from a British prison to a prison in Northern Ireland, and this is actually covered in the TV show Say Nothing, if you've ever watched that. So it's worked in the past. They want to use hunger strikes to force the British government to bring back special category status, and that's why the hunger strikes come about. The next big reason explains itself. It's to build sympathy. The prisoners hoped to increase Republican popularity, and they viewed themselves as victims of the conflict rather than being terrorists. And they hoped that if they began a hunger strike, it would build sympathy with the Republican cause through prisoners being seen to suffer and starve themselves to death for a cause that they felt very strongly and passionately about. So their goal is force these conditions on themselves, starve themselves to build sympathy so that other nationalist Republicans outside of the prisons would see it and begin to view them as heroes or martyrs for their cause, in the hope it would put pressure on the British government to bring back special category status. Another reason then, it's again self-explanatory, the armed struggle wasn't working. We know the IRA have been using this so-called armed struggle to try and win its campaign in Northern Ireland, to win a United Ireland and to bring about a United Ireland without British influence. But that armed struggle wasn't working. Increasingly so, British intelligence was beginning to make its way into the IRA and infiltrate IRA cells and gather information from within the IRA. And this meant the security services were able to prevent IRA attacks. So, as improved security measures came about, violence lessened and the armed struggle wasn't working. So the Republicans in the prison realized if they wanted to do something, they had to push forward their agenda to keep support for Republicans high. They would have to do something other than the armed struggle, and that's where the hunger strike comes in. Another reason, then, this is our last reason we'll look at, is the 1980 hunger strike. So Republicans launched a hunger strike in October 1980. However, this ended in December 1980, around 2 months in, as they believed the government met their demands. However, the government wouldn't actually fully meet the strikers' demands and instead just made some little adjustments. So, for example, the strikers wouldn't be allowed to wear their own clothes, something that they wanted, again, as part of special category status. But instead of being given prison clothes, they would be issued with civilian style clothing different to their normal prison uniforms. So it was more civilian like clothing, but it still wasn't their own clothes. And they were still, when this becomes clear that the government, in the eyes of Republicans, is going back on their promises they made, they decided in 1981 to begin a second hunger strike on the 1st of March because the government hadn't fully met their demands. So it's because of the failure of the government to take them serious after the 1980 hunger strike that they begin the 1981 hunger strike. And that's the hunger strike you think of when you've heard of the hunger strikes. What are the demands, I suppose, is a question worth asking. And the 5 demands are this, and this is a reason, again, why it comes about, the special category status. Number 1, the right to wear their own clothes, not civilian style clothing, their own clothes that they own. The right not to do prison work. They shouldn't be forced in their eyes to work in prisons as many other criminals were. The right to free association with other prisoners. So the right to freely meet with other political prisoners in their eyes. And to organise educational and leisure activities, recreational activities, things that they can organise within the prisons, pool tournaments, things like that. It's a silly example, but it's true. So that's what another demand. The right to a weekly visit, a letter each week, and a parcel from home each week, which have been cut back because they were on protest. And lastly, this is a bit of a trickier one, the restoration of lost remission through protest. Remission is when, for good behaviour in prisons, prisoners are allowed to be released early because they have shown good behaviour. However, all those who went on the blanket protest, the dirty protest, and the hunger strikes, they had this thing called remission that was lost, which meant that they weren't allowed to be released early, even if their behaviour was good. And they wanted the right, all that remission they built up, that ability to get released early, they wanted that to be restored, even though they've been taking part in these protests. So these are the 5 demands that are set out by Republicans, and this is why they're having a hunger strike. They want to achieve these 5 demands. In effect, they want special category status back. That's what this means. So, the 1981 hunger strike itself. On the 1st of March 1981, IRA inmates commanding officer, so the leader of the IRA prisoners in the H blocks, Bobby Sands, began the hunger strike. Unlike 1980, however, hunger strikers wouldn't all begin to start the strike at the same time. Instead, they would join at intervals. So they would join separated by a short period of time between each new hunger striker. And that meant that everyone wouldn't be hungry and closer to starvation and death at the same time. Instead, they would be at different points on their journey towards starvation. And it meant it was more likely then that the strike would last longer because they wouldn't all be getting extremely unwell and dying around the same period of time. They would all be, at least a week apart or thereabouts. And that would allow it then to maximize its impact. The strike itself, as you will see, gained huge. The British government, despite that wave of popularity amongst nationalists and that wave of support from people in foreign countries, remains steadfast and unwilling to accept the change in policy to allow the return of special category status. They do not want to give the prisoners these five demands, and they stand against it and allow the strike to continue. It's important at this point to mention Margaret Thatcher. She'd been elected as the first female British Prime Minister in May 1979. And Thatcher, it's important to point out, being born in England, she was still a staunch unionist and a strong British nationalist. Truth be told, she was an English nationalist, but she really is a strong believer in unionism in the United Kingdom. And she, as a result, is not willing to compromise any way, shape, or form with the IRA. The government does face criticism for attempting to force feed the prisoners, and as a result, they opt not to. Now, you can see here a quote from Margaret Thatcher speaking about the hunger strikes in May 1981, which kind of sets straight her point of view as to why she's refusing to meet the demands of the prisoners. And that is this quote: "Crime is crime is crime. It is not political, it is crime. And there can be no question of granting political status." Essentially, what she's saying is, doesn't matter why you committed a crime, you're still a criminal. It doesn't matter if you believe you did it for a political reason, it's still a crime and you're still a criminal. And we will not, under any circumstances, award special category status. So she's completely in favour of keeping the ban on special category status and continuing to treat these paramilitary prisoners as if they were any other criminal. Now, due to the limited success, Republican strategy began to change. Frank Maguire, the independent MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone, died in March 1981. And this meant that there was going to be a by-election, which is an election to replace a member of parliament who has died or give up their seat. And Republicans put extra pressure on the government by deciding they would stand Bobby Sands, the leader of the IRA hunger strikers, as a candidate in that upcoming by-election. He stood as a, quote, anti-H Bloc candidate. So he didn't stand for a political party. He didn't stand for Sinn Féin or anything like that. He stood as anti-H Bloc. On the 40th day then of Bobby Sands' strike, he was elected as a member of parliament for Fermanagh and South Tyrone. And this creates a massive headache for the British government. But eventually, and hopefully, I'm going to watch this video here, but hopefully we don't get hit with an advert. This happens 66 days into Bobby Sands' hunger strike.
Summon the power of joy.
Well, that brings us right up to today, and it's my job to tell you what you're about to see for the next in their most romantic and seductive poses.
We interrupt our regular program schedule to bring you the following special report from ABC News, Washington. Here is Ted Koppel.
Bobby Sands is dead. The 27-year-old member of the Irish Republican Army who went on a protest hunger strike 66 days ago has died. The British press office in Belfast announced this evening that Sands died at 1:17 Tuesday morning, Belfast time. That would have been 8:17 p.m. Eastern time here in the United States. Sands, who was serving a 14-year prison term on a weapons possession charge, had been demanding special status as a political prisoner. A number of other Irish Republican Army members, also imprisoned by the British, have joined Sands in his protest, and several of them are also well into a hunger strike. To repeat, Bobby Sands, 27 years old, and surrounded by members of his family at Maze Prison in Belfast, died tonight in the 66th day of his hunger strike.
Now, the reason I've shown you that clip is because it shows you the importance of the hunger strike within the conflict. It's certainly the most divisive moment throughout the 30 years of the conflict. And it is also really important for the international dimension. It really has a massive impact. And there you can see a breaking news report in America following the death of Sands, which shows you just how significant a moment in the Troubles this is, that it's being reported even in the United States on the news there. In the aftermath then, Sands' election provided global publicity for Sinn Féin, the IRA, and the hunger strikes. So it's a massive boost to publicity for them. There was a significant international pressure on both sides, but no compromise was reached. On the 5th of May, as we saw, Bobby Sands died on hunger strike on his 66th day of hunger strike. But the strike would continue until the 3rd of October 1981. 9 other prisoners died on hunger strike. If you were to get a question on reactions to the hunger strike, one of the things you can say is Sands died and 9 other people followed him. I know you may be thinking that's not a reaction, and it's not, truth be told, but see it accepted in the mark scheme. So they will accept you saying that Bobby Sands died on the 66th day of hunger strike on the 5th of May, and 9 other prisoners died on hunger strike following him. And that brings us then into the reactions to the hunger strikes themselves. In terms of nationalists, well, 100,000 mourners, a sixth of the estimated Catholic population of Northern Ireland, so 1 in every 6 Catholics in Northern Ireland, attended the funeral of Bobby Sands. Increased nationalist alienation from the British state. So this really radicalizes many nationalists. Many of them feel even further removed from the British state because the British state, in their eyes, has allowed a man to die. Margaret Thatcher has allowed a man to die, even though Sands took that decision to starve himself. 100,000 mourners, that shows you the massive support amongst many nationalist Republicans in Northern Ireland for the hunger strikes themselves. As you'll see here, many nationalists viewed the prisoners' cause, the right to wear their own clothing, the right to freely assemble, their weekly packages, their political status, etc. They saw that as reasonable, and they saw Margaret Thatcher's response, on the other hand, as being very heavy-handed. And so it really begins a process where Margaret Thatcher is vilified. She's painted as a villain by Republicans. And that is a narrative which really does pick up momentum as the strikes continue. Support for the IRA, unsurprisingly, surges. Particularly, there's increased support for the IRA internationally. But within Northern Ireland, the hunger strikes, as I said earlier in the video, is very, very divisive. And with many nationalists seeing Thatcher as the villain, seeing the hunger strikers as martyrs, as people who are heroes who died for their cause, they begin to basically go in droves and flock to the IRA with increased support. It would also be fair in this moment to say that not only did support for the IRA surge, but so too did membership of the IRA. Another big important point here is Republican support increased with Owen Corran. This was the man who nominated Sands and ran his campaign to run in Fermanagh and South Tyrone. He actually showed that this wasn't a fluke, this wasn't a one-off, and he won the by-election to replace Bobby Sands after he died on hunger strike. So it showed you there was still strong support, even though Sands had died. There was still strong increased support for the Republican cause, probably, truth be told, a large part due to Sands' death. Gerry Adams, it's significant to mention at this point in time, Gerry Adams would then be elected as the MP for Belfast West in 1983. And that's significant as part of this change in Republican strategy, because Republicans had not believed in using politics prior to the hunger strike. They were very much of the view that political violence was the only way to get the British out of Ireland, and political violence was the only way to get a united Ireland. Now we're beginning to see a change where you have Sinn Féin, the most Republican of parties in Northern Ireland, is putting its own leader, Gerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin, forward to stand in elections, and he wins. So now you have the leader of, the Republican Sinn Féin, the group which is the political wing of the IRA, is now elected to the British Parliament at Westminster. There is a video clip you can see down the bottom, which I will just play briefly here, which shows you the reaction by nationalists to Sands' death. It's from a BBC News report as part of the 9 o'clock news in 1981.
To the tens of thousands who watched his coffin to the grave, this was the burial of Bobby Sands, martyr. The full paraphernalia of an IRA military funeral, the Irish tricolour draped over the coffin after a funeral mass in St. Luke's Church, where the priest asked the congregation to pray not only for Bobby Sands, but for the 2 other men who died last night, a policeman and a terrorist bomber. The masked escort in combat uniforms prepared to march the 4 miles to Milltown Cemetery. An army helicopter grinding relentlessly overhead all but drowned the tones of the Irish pipes, and there were shouts from the stewards as they tried to supervise the coverage by the world's press. for this was both funeral cortege and demonstration. Tens of thousands of people from all over Northern Ireland and from the south. A grim-faced demonstration of support for the political aims of the hunger strikers, overtaking the private grief of the Sands family. Such a procession had to be prevented from having any contact with a Protestant area, and huge screens had been erected to avoid even the sight of the cortege provoking trouble. The security forces kept their distance as the procession passed the Protestant Suffolk district. Outside a shopping centre in Andersonstown came the symbolic moment for the Republicans. 3 masked men stepped forward and obeyed orders in Irish to fire a 3-volley salute. Illegal uniforms, illegal shooting, all grist to the mill for the convictions of Republican and Loyalist. Among the mourners, the vice presidents of Provisional Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams and David O'Connell. There was a huge crowd at the entrance to the cemetery, perched on crosses and headstones. At the graveside, in the pouring rain, Sands' mother, father, sister, and his 8-year-old son. Sands, the elected MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone, serving 14 years for the possession of firearms, starved himself to death and into a place in Republican history.
So you can see from that video there the sheer, I suppose, strength of support from Republicans and from Catholics across Northern Ireland in response to Sands' death. You can also see, she talks about the world's media being present and also how Sands starved himself into a place in Republican history. And it really shows you that is the support from the nationalist side, which is. It's also worth mentioning then that this increase in support for the Republican cause and for the IRA, this increase in IRA membership, results in increased IRA violence and indeed increased violence across Northern Ireland in response to that IRA violence, which results in 61 deaths. And that's definitely a point you can make in reactions to the hunger strikes, because it is mentioned in the mark scheme on previous occasions when this question has been asked as a name marker. It is important then to have a look at unionists and their response to the hunger strikes. Many students will get distracted when completing a name marker on reactions, that they will focus entirely on or mostly on the Republican or nationalist side, and they won't focus on the unionist side. It is important, as I always say when doing these name mark questions, to make sure you get a good range or balance, and therefore you have to mention the unionist reaction as well. Don't just focus on the nationalist Catholic reaction. The first big thing then, the first big reactions from unionists is that they're glad the government did not give in to meet the demands of the strikers. So those 5 demands that they had sought as part of this hunger strike, essentially asking for the return of special category status. The unionist community is very happy that the government doesn't give in, because they see these, I should say, murderers and criminals as being just that, murderers and criminals. They don't think they deserve special category status. They agree with Margaret Thatcher that crime is crime is crime, and they are glad that the government doesn't give in. There is, of course, concern amongst unionists at the growing support for the IRA, and particularly this next point really explains that. Unionists viewed the massive crowd at Sands' funeral as evidence of support for terrorism from nationalists. So they look at that and they say there's 100,000 people on the streets of Northern Ireland, on the streets of Belfast, as part of this funeral route from Twinbrook to Milltown Cemetery as Sands is being buried, and they are really concerned that they think, look how many nationalists, many Catholics actually support the IRA, as demonstrated by their attendance at Sands' funeral. So it really, that massive crowd really causes anxiety amongst unionists about just how powerful the IRA is becoming and how strongly supported it is in nationalist areas. There's real concern then by unionists at the limited number of army and police to deal with violence. So as violence increases, support for the IRA grows, membership of the IRA grows. Unionists become very concerned that the number of army and police on the streets in Northern Ireland is not adequate to actually deal with the violence. And then the final sort of area that we'll look at as a reaction is the British and Irish governments. We'll just put those two together. So get a range. You get a couple of points from nationalists, a couple of points from unionists, and a couple of points from British and Irish governments together to make a name mark response. No concessions were made, and this is a big point here, during the strike. So they don't give any concessions. They don't meet the 5 demands during the strike itself. However, within a week of the strike's end, the new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, James Pryor, announced that a number of concessions would be granted. These included prisoners could wear their own clothing, one of the 5 demands. 50% of the remission lost by protesters would be restored, sort of almost meeting one of the additional demands. More prison visits would be allowed. More association amongst prisoners would be allowed. So the right to actually associate freely and meet with each other would be allowed to a greater extent. The protest in the prison effectively ends in October 1981 because these concessions are granted. In many ways, looking at that, you see, this is examples of the British government actually meeting the demands of the prisoners, even if not initially very fully. And so many people have gone on to say that this has actually been what's called a Pyrrhic victory for the British government, in that, okay, they won, the strike was called off. The IRA ultimately, it seemed at first lost, but when we consider the fact that the British government is forced to give in to many of their demands, as demonstrated by the concessions announced by James Pryor, and then you consider the reputational damage that has been done to the British government internationally, and the massive increase in support internationally for the IRA, especially from places like the United States of America, it's almost like they've won, but at what cost? They may have officially won, but really this is more of a propaganda victory for the IRA. And then, of course, you can see at the very bottom, the Irish government begins to push for a new political solution in Northern Ireland. Again, worried about the rise of Sinn Féin, worried about the rise of the support for the Republican movement and support for the IRA. There is a real push by the Irish government to try and stop that by looking for a political solution to persuade nationalists to support political, normal, peaceful politics as opposed to political violence. And this leads into the real area of change in Republican strategy. On your screen, you can see two images. The one on the left is the ballot box, which people use to vote. You can see a voting slip going into it there. And the one on the right is the Armalite, a weapon that was favoured by the IRA. And previously, the IRA would just have used this Armalite. They would have just used, Republicans would have just used political violence. But after the hunger strike, it begins to change, and they begin to use politics alongside political violence. And this leads to, as you can see, the Armalite and ballot box strategy. Sand's election had shown Republicans the benefit of electoral politics, so politics, peaceful politics using elections. The election of his electoral agent, Owen Corran, as the MP in the by-election following Sand's death, showed them his victory wasn't a fluke. This wasn't a one-off, as we said earlier. There was an opportunity for Republicans to continue to win elections. Sinn Féin officially adopted the policy of standing in elections during their 1981 Ardèche, which is just their party conference. So during that party conference, they officially adopt this position of standing in elections in Northern Ireland, something which they hadn't done in its history. And here's a quote you can see from Danny Morrison, a senior member of Sinn Féin, who, speaking to the conference, said, "With a ballot box in one hand and the Armalite in the other, we take power in Ireland. Hence why it's the Armalite and the ballot box. It's about electoral politics alongside political violence." And that's what it's saying here. They're going to use the same of those hand in hand, electoral politics and violence. Another big consequence here, as the strategy changes, is that Sinn Féin's success results in a decline in support for the SDLP. Sinn Féin support continued to grow and grow and grow in elections immediately after the hunger strikes. We saw that earlier on we know by 1983, Gerry Adams is elected as the Member of Parliament for Belfast West. But that's not just one example. There are multiple examples of elections that Sinn Féin win, which really shows their growth in power amongst nationalists across Northern Ireland. They won an increasing number of local council seats in the early 1980s. So local councils like Belfast City Council, etc. Sinn Féin standing in elections begins to win seats on these councils, which shows their growing support. And you can have a look here. 1983, of course, we know, as I said already, Gerry Adams, the new Sinn Féin president, beat Jerry Fitt of the SDLP to become the Member of Parliament for Belfast West. So Sinn Féin has not only won, but they've actually beaten the incumbent, the person who held the seat, Jerry Fitt, who was a member of the SDLP, which really summarises the sort of the change in voting which is taking place within nationalism at that time. And just above that, you can see in 1983, Sinn Féin took 1/10 of the Northern Ireland vote in the general election. So 1 in every 10 people who voted in the 1983 general election in Northern Ireland voted for Sinn Féin, which again shows that growth and support from within nationalism and republicanism for Sinn Féin, preferring them over the SDLP. Although the SDLP are still the biggest party at this time, but Sinn Féin are definitely chipping away at their support. And you can see that at the bottom. The SDLP, now led by John Hume, who we mentioned, of course, when we talked about the civil rights movement earlier in the year. The SDLP, led by John Hume, saw its vote decline, although it is still by far the biggest nationalist party. As a result, the SDLP begins to look more and more to Dublin for support, and that's something we'll see in greater detail when we come to look at the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. Both governments then, the British and the Irish governments, became concerned about the growth of Sinn Féin. Why? Well, Sinn Féin is more hardline. It was the political wing of the Provisional IRA. Growth and support for Sinn Féin roughly equals growth and support for the IRA. And the SDLP was more moderate and committed to electoral politics. So both governments begin to worry that what we might see happening in Northern Ireland is more and more nationalists supporting more hardline Sinn Féin and not the SDLP, which would make it difficult for any peace and stability and any peace deal down the line to take place, because unionists are never at this point in time going to be wanting to work with Sinn Féin. They see them as the political wing of the IRA and they're right. So it makes any potential stability that could be in the future in Northern Ireland seem extremely unlikely. As a result then, and this is again coming into a point we'll see in the Anglo-Irish Agreement when we look at that, both governments began to cooperate closer than ever before in the hope that both of the British and Irish governments working together would find a political solution which would feature the SDLP, give support to the SDLP, make the SDLP look strong and as if they are delivering for the people of Northern Ireland, which would then limit Sinn Féin's support and stop the IRA getting increased support amongst Catholics. And that is that. That is the end of the hunger strikes itself. I would say that if it's likely to come up, it's very unlikely you'll get a question as a name marker on the strike itself, the events of the strike. You're much more likely to get a question on the reactions to the hunger strike or the reasons for them. Now, the reasons is probably a nicer, easier one to do because it's just those 6 reasons that we discussed at the beginning of the video. The reactions, there's a bit more detail, but as long as you have, a handful of points from nationalist reaction, a handful of points from unionist reaction, and a handful of points from the reactions of the British and Irish government, you will have enough to allow you to get name marks. This is a question which has not been asked as a name marker in quite a few years, and I think it's more likely to come up in the 2026 paper. So it's definitely worth knowing this topic